Welcome to Linda's Corner. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to be talking about creating connections through storytelling. I'm delighted to welcome special guest Jill Phillips from the UK. Jill is a retired occupational therapist and the author of Lamlash Street, a portrait of 1960s post-war London through one family story. She is a storyteller with a passion to inspire families to connect through the telling of their past. Welcome, Jill. I'm so glad you could join with me today.
Oh, it's lovely of you to have me. Thank you so much.
I am so excited personally to be talking about this topic of connecting families through stories. And this weekend, I attended a family reunion for my mother's side. And part of the activities that they did was a reader's theater sharing some stories from my great grandparents. And I got to be one of the people sharing the stories. And so I got to be Hedda Rebecca Lundberg and tell her story about being born in Sweden and then becoming deaf as a child. And then she could still understand because she could read lips and so she could communicate. At 15, her father passed away, and at 17, she emigrated by herself to the United States. And then 2 years later, her mother and sister joined her. And then eventually she married another Swedish immigrant. And when the kids grew up, they taught Swedish here in the United States as the kids, that was their first language. And then the kids picked up English from school and from their friends. And then when the grandkids came along, they only spoke English. And the only way that she could communicate with them was through her husband. So if they would talk, he would mouth it in Swedish so she could understand. And when she would talk, he would translate. And as I had a chance to tell her stories, all of a sudden, she has always been a name on the family tree. And then she became a person.
Yeah,
And
right.
as I thought, it started to make me ask questions like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine how challenging that would be, and have to immigrate by yourself as a teenager where you don't know the language and you're by yourself. And um I just thought how incredibly brave she was, and what a challenge. Anyway, she turned into a person. So stories turn names into people.
Oh, that's so right. I mean, in a sense, my book is about, it's when I was 10 years old. It was around 1962, 63. And I really wrote it because I wanted those family stories to be recorded, like you were just saying, for the family not to lose them. And what happened, has been happening over the past 5 or 6 years, is the last of my mum's generation, her brothers and sisters and brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws have all gone. And so mum was the youngest of 12. And so what happened was I could one by one see people's disappearing, and the lovely stories they used to tell were disappearing, like my aunts and my uncles. And so I thought, before I forget the stories as well, because we're all getting older at the same time, what I'd like to do is just to try and write down some of those stories so that they're just not lost. And that really was the extent of what I was thinking. I hadn't thought, as you just indicated, of the ramifications beyond that, that once you write these stories, they become real people. And what I found, I was listening with interest to what you were saying, because what I found was that when I was around 11, 12, we moved from London down to Bexley Heath, which is where the parents lived for years. And I didn't really understand why. For me, I left all my friends behind. I couldn't communicate with them anymore. There was no internet in those days. And I thought it was one of the worst decisions my parents could have made. And then when I started writing the story, I realized that, number one, I've been carrying this resentment with me for years. But then as I wrote the story out, and you start talking to your relatives, as I'm sure you did, about, oh, right, do you remember when so-and-so did this? And they said, oh, yes, but did you know this piece as well? And they sort of build onto the story, so you get a much fuller picture of the character of the person at the time. And so what I realized was that the reason that my family relocated at that time was because everybody was doing exactly the same thing. It had never occurred to me that it was as a result of the economies of the Second World War, which was only 18 years earlier. So not a huge amount of time had elapsed. And after the war, as you probably understand as well, is there's a lot of damage to buildings, a lot of damage to infrastructure. Businesses have damaged buildings, and the businesses were struggling because they were in old, bombed out type buildings, and they had their issues. So there was a big move at the time to move a lot of people outside London into new towns, they called them. Milton Keynes was one of these new towns. It was the 60s. We designed this town around the needs of the people. And whereas in London up till then, things were just built piecemeal, just add another house here, another house there. These were whole developments that had been put in place. And with them, the businesses went as well with huge tax incentives. So what I learned about my family story was it wasn't just my mum and dad saying, oh, let's move. Everybody was doing the same. Although for me, back in the 1960s, and I carried this for a lot of years, I was very resentful of the fact that I'd lost my cousins. My aunts and uncles didn't pop into the house because they were miles away. And so for me, it was a way of understanding who my mum and dad were and why they did these things. And I don't think I would have had that much thought about any of those things if I hadn't written the book. And when you write a book, you also spend more time with your relatives, with the people that tell you the stories. And you often go back and saying, well, can you tell me about this and can you tell me about that? And so it's more on your mind. So it was a very therapeutic experience. And I'd certainly recommend it to anybody, because no matter how many books you sell, even if it's not a book, if it's just a manuscript, whatever you want to do with it, the healing that occurs when you begin to understand that your family were really people as well, that is worth everything, really, to be honest.
Is beautiful. And what an incredible insight as you're sharing your story. And I think life has to be lived forward. That's the only direction time goes, but we understand it backwards. And so if we don't look backwards, then we don't understand our lives. We don't understand our parents. Somehow when we're little, we just expect our parents are perfect and they should know everything. And when they don't, we're so disappointed. And we forget that they're people as well, and they are dealing with their struggles and their issues and whatever. So that's beautiful. So now, some people, you have an interesting story. You lived at an interesting time, and those stories are so important to capture. A lot of people feel like, well, I've never done anything special, and I'm not important, and I don't have a story, and I don't have a whatever. Remember, we asked my grandfather, what was it like when you were little? He said, well, I just did the same thing everybody else did. And this is one of the sons of this Hedda that I was talking about. He grew up speaking Swedish. His mother was deaf. I mean, there were stories, but he just didn't think that he had any.
Yeah, I come across that as well. I was talking to a good friend of mine a while ago, and she said, oh, it's really good you've written a book. I said, well, you could write a book as well. She said, but we just did what everyone else did. And who's on earth is going to want to listen to my stories? And I don't think any of us really understand how the struggles and the good times we went through are actually going to help other people with their struggles and their good times. So I think anybody that thinks that their story is not worth telling is wrong, to be honest. Because I thought, well, I was born in, sure, I was in London, sure, the war, things were around all the time. And so, but all I did was play on the streets and went to school and did what my mum said and listened to all the family stories and learned to swim and had a little bit of a romance. So I did all these things which were normal, and I wasn't doing it for anybody outside the family. I really just did it because I wanted to capture the family story. But then by the time I'd written the book and some people outside the family had, say, read the manuscript and, the editors give you feedback and other people in the process. And they're saying, this is really good, what I didn't know about this. Really, is that what life was like? And I'm thinking, yeah. and it took a while. So by the time half a dozen people say the same or very similar things, and they're saying, wow, I really enjoyed it. I could really relate to what you were talking about. Yes, because in my family, our bath night, our tin bath by the fire, because nobody had bathrooms, is where we used to have to bathe. Yes, our bath night was Friday night. It wasn't Saturday. Oh, but ours was Saturday. Because we wanted to be clean. Because then we went to church the next day. So it's helping other people to reminisce, to remember those days. But I hope what it's also doing is people are saying, well, maybe I do have a story to tell. Maybe it is worth writing some of these stories down, because everyone's experience is slightly different. Nobody had the same life as I did. Um, but it has a lot more meaning than I ever dreamed it would. I mean, I'm not an author, I'm an author now, but I didn't grow up in a literary family. We didn't sit around saying, oh, I'm going to write a book or anything like that. It was like, no, it's just, no. And even when you write the book, very few family members will say to you, oh, that's really exciting. No, what most of them do is they say, oh, you're writing a book, and then they'll talk about something else. So,
Exactly.
there's not a lot of encouragement, but having done this, and I'm looking at my book now, so I mean, I can, to have this book physically here that I can hold on to was one of the biggest thrills in my life. And the other thing, I'll just touch on this because it has real meaning for me, is as I indicated when we were just chatting earlier, Mum died of COVID in January of this year. She was 90, so she'd had a long life, but nonetheless, it was still my mum. And last year, and a lot of the book is about mum, because when you're 10 years old, your mother is everything in terms of she tells you what to do, what not to do. It's time for this, it's time for that. So she was a key figure in the whole story. And what was so nice was last June, mum was 90 last May, and in June, I had the manuscript. It was all together. Editors had looked through it, and it was all looking fairly good. And I just printed it out. I had pages and pages come through on the printer. And I said to mum, oh, I'm just making a few corrections. She said, oh, can I read the book? I said, oh, yes, please do. She read the book. I don't think she even asked for a cup of tea for the whole time she was reading the book, which is really unusual for mum. But she was grinning from ear to ear the whole time. So I still can see her. She was on the sofa on the right-hand seat, which is where she always sat. And she was looking at, and have you got another page? Have you got another page? And she was reading through this whole book, and she was so happy. I said, well, is it any good? Did you enjoy it? Oh, yes, that was really good. I thought, oh, well, that's nice to know. So, and the other really nice thing is, and this is the other reason I'd encourage other people to write down their family stories, is that, so mum is gone. She went in January. And yet here I am in the middle of the year still talking about her. So she's gone, but she's not forgotten. And I think when people are thinking of writing their stories, they get tied up in their head about, oh, it's not going to be good enough. I'm not Shakespeare. I can't write wonderful prose and all this sort of thing. No, that's not what it's all about. It's all about keeping the memories for your family and passing them on to the next generation. And for the people that are here now, allowing them to look back on that time as well. So I see it as hopefully a tribute to what mum did, what her decisions were, and the sacrifice she made in terms of her time and effort. And that's not forgotten. So it's a piece of family history. Mum worked hard, and her efforts are now still being talked about. That to me is worth everything. It gives real. You're really praising what the family has done prior to you. You are acknowledging that you're not the first person to improve in terms of family wealth and well-being and so on. There's actually a research quote: "You're standing on the shoulders of giants," which means, yes, you're doing your research, but it's based on what other people have done before. And for me, that's one of the big things about writing a book. You are standing on the shoulders of the earlier generations and the sacrifices they made so that you now can have the lifestyle you have. And that's what I think we should be doing.
That is beautiful. And I love, as you've talked about, many different, like the audience of who is going to read this. I think you have a wonderful story that interests a lot of people. But as a general rule, if we're trying to write our story, we're not doing it to try to make money, because unless we're a movie star or a sports hero or whatever, then not everybody is going to be interested. But it doesn't matter that we're trying to impress the whole world. It matters to the people that matter to us. It matters to ourselves, and it mattered to your mother, and it matters to the posterity and to the family. And then if those stories continue and they matter to other people, that's beautiful. Here, in the United States, there was a little girl. Her name is Lara Ingalls, and she wrote her story. I don't know if you're familiar, if that's something that's in the UK, but her
Little
little
House on the Prairie. Yes,
exactly, those
yeah,
little
yeah,
stories that she
yeah.
wrote that, nobody would think to write that because that's what everybody was doing, but she was a child, and so, everything was new and interesting, and she wrote it down, and she captured a piece of history that then became an important resource for apparently the whole world. So we never know. We never know what the effects will be of sharing our story and recording that story. But I know that it's important. My mother wrote her family, her personal history, and then she helped my father work on his, and she had it bound in a book, and she was so proud of herself that I've written this book, and to her it just even gave her life more meaning to be able to see it in that bound book and be able to turn the pages, and she was so excited to share copies.
Oh,
And I
yeah,
know.
no, it does. It does actually. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, and my mother-in-law passed away last year, and so I
Sorry.
made just a photo book with some words in it for my father-in-law with family pictures, and he carried it around. He talked to it because he didn't have his wife to talk to, and it was just so precious to him. It was like the first gift I've ever given him that he really loved and appreciated, and it was about him. It gave him a sense of purpose and value, like, wow, look at my life. It matters to somebody enough to record it.
Yeah, I hope that's what Mum got from that as well. I hope that's what the family gets from that as well. That everything that we do, it does matter. We impact on people more than we realise. And this book is it's called Lamlash Street. By the way, I should mention the title of the book. Is actually, if I can just show you on the front
Oh,
cover,
that's
actually, I've
yeah.
got a couple of family photos. So yes, that's me there when I'm 10.
Oh, wow.
But this, I don't know if you can see that, but that there, that is actually outside the house.
Oh,
I'm
beautiful.
not sure there's too much glare there. And that's my auntie standing on the steps. So for me to hold a book where it's like that's my auntie's, they're standing on the steps, and that's a picture of me, and that's the street I grew up on. And it's a bit surreal, but anybody can do it. If I can do it, I mean, the only thing I'd written, okay, so I was in management and professional and so on, and I did my thesis. A thesis is lovely, yes, it's an awful lot of work, but it's not exactly the most entertaining thing that you're going to read. I don't think hardly anybody even bought a copy of mine. I've never had any money from it, so I don't think anybody did. And that's the only thing that kept me going on this book. This book took me 3 years to write.
Wow.
Oh yeah, and it was quite the journey. At times it was, oh yes, I know exactly what I'm going to write, and other times like, oh, I haven't done a thing for months. What am I going to do? And fortunately, at that point, I had a book coach, so there was this person saying, "How are you doing? Have you done this yet?" So that was one of the good things I did. Um, but the only reason I had some spare money for that is because my uncle died back in 2011, and my uncle and auntie used to live with us in one big extended family house on Lamlash Street. And when his apartment was sold, myself and my brother inherited a little bit of money, and so I took a percentage of that to help me get through writing the book. But the basic stories I put together from talking to family members. It's just that by the time it got to the third year, I realised I needed a bit of help. So that's the way I did it. But you don't have to. It's whatever you prefer to do.
That's lovely. So it's not just your story, it includes the stories of your family. Now, didn't you have an uncle who served in the war and he talked about war stories? Are those in there as well?
They are, yes. So the uncle who I just referred to, he
Okay.
was in the Merchant Navy. So in the war, there's the Merchant Navy and then there's the Royal Navy. Now, the Royal Navy, if you were serving in the Second World War, that had uniforms, the caps, the whole thing. If you're in the Merchant Navy, then all you had was a little silver pin with M and N written on it to put on your day clothes. So you didn't get the uniform. The men were dying as well. I mean, they would do the Atlantic convoy run. So back in World War II, because England was an island, we didn't have enough ability to grow enough vegetables and fruits and raw materials to feed everybody. And so the United States were the people who were helping to feed England during the war. And he talks about the time that he went to New York in the Merchant Navy, and he talked about the time when he was in a baking competition. He had to judge the cake to see which was the best one, and it was him and a lot of his shipmates. I think it was about 5 or 6 of them, and they were around 18, 19 years old. And they're invited to this local ladies group, and they had a competition, and they had to decide who the winner was. And so they chose in the end. It was this lady who happened to be 70 years old. She was the most senior member of the group, and they had a lovely time, and everything went well. But he said at the time how they were spoken to by the people in New York as if they were war heroes. He said, "Oh, what war heroes? We're just doing what we need to do." And people in the US were so concerned about people in the UK and how they were doing and how tough it was for them. But on the way back from that run to New York, some of the U-boats attacked the convoy they were in, and they lost some of the boats. And he said the worst thing was that they weren't allowed to stop to pick up any survivors at all. So at the age of 17, he was in a boat coming back to the UK from the US, and he could see the sailors bobbing up and down in the oily black water. And he said, all we could do, he said, we could throw nets over the side. So if they could manage to get to the boat, then they could and hold on to the nets. They might be able to pull them up. But he said, no, there was no way that they could stop, because once they stopped, they were targets themselves, and they were carrying essential supplies for the UK. So he was only 17 and 18 when he faced these sorts of things. Yeah, if you talk to him, he was a lovely man, very happy, very chatty, very sociable. And I didn't know about any of these things until it was the end of 2010. I was over from Canada to visit mum and dad, and uncle lived just across the road. And so I said to uncle about, how you doing? He said, I've written down some stories. I said, oh, what do you mean some stories? He said, well, I've written down some of the stories from my life in World War II, which is how I got to have the stories. And I said, oh, tell me about them. So he told me a little bit about it, and I thought nothing more of it, and then went back to Canada. And then about 3 months later, unfortunately, he fell and he died within about 2 or 3 days. So we were clearing out his apartment about 3 or 4 months later. We came over for the funeral. And I came across these notes he'd written about his exploits during the war. And he said to me when I last saw him, I really want to turn this into a book. I thought, you know what? I'm going to take some of the money from the apartment, from the inheritance, and I'm going to make sure that this gets included in the book. And that's exactly what I did. So I have flashbacks to World War II, which is honouring Uncle's contribution. Also, I have Mum there, which is honouring Mum's contribution. So it's to me, it was just the right thing to do, to take some of the gift he gave me to allow his dream to go forward, even after he'd gone. So for me, that's just felt so right.
That is so beautiful. What an honor to tribute to honor him that way through that storytelling. That is beautiful, and that's something that he wanted done. That's fantastic. And I'm so glad that he wrote them down when he did, because we get to a point where we can't remember, or we pass on, or things disappear. Like my father-in-law, for example, had an incredible story. He circumnavigated the world when he was
Wow.
20, and he has all these stories, but he's starting to get dementia, and
Yeah.
and he cannot share them very well. And so it's kind of painful to think we know there are stories, but we can't get them all. And I have a
Yeah.
sister. She says, I know I probably should write my story. I should probably write my history, but I'm not dead yet, so I still have stuff to do. I don't want to write it when it's not finished. And I think, no, now is a great time while you're healthy and alive, and it's okay that there's still some chapters in your life that haven't taken place yet. It doesn't mean we have to wait until the end to record what we're doing now or what we have done in the past.
Yeah, and what I found was people are very much like that. They don't see the relevance of their own stories, and they don't understand, as you've said, how things can change and they can't remember the stories. So what I did when I knew some of the stories, little bits and pieces, some of the stories. And so what I used to do, with mum in particular and my cousins, I'd just be very casual in my approach. I didn't even tell them I was writing a book. It's not, "Oh, I'm writing a book." No, no. It was like, so mum, you remember when Uncle went, he was in the pub once and somebody called him a coward. Can you just, do you know anything about that? And so I just made it very, very casual, not like a job interview at all, not like I'm going to write this down. And so as she was talking, I'd just write a few notes down, just a few jot notes. And as soon as I'd finished, I'd spend the next half an hour writing them out before I forgot. So I had like memory joggers, and then I would write them all down. And that's how I did it. I actually didn't tell anybody I was writing a book about them until it got to the manuscript phase. I didn't say to anybody, "Should I be writing?" But it's like, this is what I've done, this is what I'm doing, that sort of thing. And I found that worked really well. But I was also very cognizant of the fact that I didn't want people to be upset by what was in the book. So I did filter out some things that I thought would be a bit too controversial. And, these are family stories, and some family stories are a secret for a reason. And so I thought, no, I'm going to honor that as well. I'm not the judge. It's not for me to decide who gets to hear these stories. The people will hear the version of the family stories that the family wants them to hear. I don't have an issue with that. I'm not here to do anything else.
That brings up an interesting point, and that history is always edited twice. Even when you have that first person primary source, it is kind of edited by the person writing, and then it is interpreted by the person reading. So that kind of thing happens. And as we read histories, we kind of have to keep that in mind a little bit. Um, that things it could be the way that someone remembers and not exactly the way that it happened, or they could be editing a little bit for one reason or another. And it's helpful. I loved how you said before, when you get different stories coming in from different directions, and it kind of helps something that's flat flesh out and become 3D, and then you have a more accurate picture of what's going on. But I agree with you. When we're sharing someone else's story, we have to be respectful and make sure that they are honored, as you have been very careful to honor your mother and your uncle and the other family members. So well done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I would love to hear, if you don't mind, just a couple things about um, what it, some of your stories. You grew up in that post World War II. How did that affect? How did that change your experience?
Well, what was interesting about that era is it's on the cusp of modern attitudes and old World War II attitudes. So, for example, the roles of women have changed tremendously since the 1960s, and for the better, in my opinion, to be honest. When I grew up, I was schooled in the skills of cooking, cleaning, how to operate at 10 years old, how to operate the washing machine, because one day I would be running a household,
Mhm.
and I had to keep a clean and tidy house. This is what my mother said. um, so that the husband could go out to work, and when he came back, it was calm, meals were cooked. The slippers and pipe type thing, smoke the pipe and put your feet up. The slippers would be what the dad would do. The children would be quiet, they would be ready to go to bed. And I can remember looking at my brother, who was 3 years younger than me, thinking, I've got to learn how to wash clothes and iron, and you don't have to do any of this. I could not. I thought it was a real injustice, which I now feel it certainly was. But in those days, that was the expectation. But so that my mother was schooling me that way, but she was also doing things which were not of her time. So, for example, or class. is so we rented a house. In those days, everybody we knew rented a house. Only like the well-to-do actually had a mortgage and bought a house. So when we were moving from London out to Kent, Mum says, we are never going to rent a house again because it's just a waste of money. We are going to buy a house. And so she went to she had 12 brothers and sisters, and obviously they had their comments about what you should and should not do in life, especially the men. And she was told, no, you do not mortgage a house because it's just a millstone round your neck. You're going to be paying that off for years. You're much better off renting a house. And she said, and I told them I was going to do it anyway, so they should just get used to that. So Mum had a real independent streak in her. It's quite funny when I look at Mum and Dad's relationship, because Dad was a very quiet man, just wanted a quiet life. Just give me a nice hot meal in the evening and I'll go out the next day and earn a living. Whereas Mum was the trailblazer. So not only was that the case that we actually, now, and because of that, we inherited money, which is great for the family. But it also changed who I was as well. So instead of me being, although, as I said, I was annoyed about the ironing and all that sort of stuff, that had to be taught how to iron shirts and this. But because Mum had been such a trailblazer, I've sort of done the same thing as well. She never once told me that's the way life should be, but it was just by being a role model. And I'm absolutely convinced that as parents and as adults, for the younger people, role models is what we should be. And I'm not necessarily talking about the fixed role models of, this is what you do because you're a girl, this is what you do because you're a boy. I'm talking about not being afraid to try a few things. So when I wrote the book, did I really think it was going to be published? No, not really. When I started putting these stories together, did I think anybody would be interested in them? No, I thought if I sold one book, that would be my mother, buying the book. Did I think I'd be doing podcasts and Zoom meetings? No, never in a million years. But what I learned from Mum is sometimes you have to do things just because it's what you want to do. And if you keep listening to certain people in your life, you will never do anything and have a ton of regrets. So Mum always was a bit of a trailblazer, and I thank her for that deeply, and I hope that comes through in the story, because back in the 1960s, it was a very different time, and she has done so many amazing things for us. I don't think even she understood or how much they are appreciated. It was to what we have now is because of what she did there.
Well, I'm glad for what she did, and I'm glad for what you're doing, and I'm glad that you're doing a Zoom meeting and a podcast, or else you and I would never have had the chance to meet. And I feel like my life is a little brighter because I've had the opportunity to connect with you. So thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you. It's been lovely, actually. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
So have I. In closing, I'd like to share a quote by Mary Catherine Bateson. She said, "The human species thinks in metaphors and learns through stories." Today, I invite you to record and share your story. See you next time on Linda's Corner.